Welcome back to another episode of our movie business podcast series, where we look to make sense of the current trends in the film and television industry. My name is Ilan Haimoff, and I'm a partner and the department head of the Profit Participation Group at GHJ. In this podcast series, I'm joined, as always, by Professor Jason Squire of the USC School of Cinematic Arts, as well as the editor of the Movie Business Book, 4th edition, to discuss with our guest, Steve Mangel of UniFi Completion Guarantors, the current trends with completion bonds in the entertainment industry. Jason will introduce Steve and get us going with our discussion. Jason, please take it from here.
Well, thanks so much, Ilan. And Steve Mangel is president of UniFi Completion Guarantors, a boutique completion bond company based in Los Angeles. Before UniFi, he served as president and CEO of International Film Guarantors for 15 years, responsible for managing all the company's operations. Steve has supervised bonding hundreds of film and television productions with aggregate production budgets exceeding $10 billion. Prior to IFG, for 12 years he was a senior executive at Live Entertainment, in charge of business and legal affairs, where he also founded and headed its international sales division. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
Steve, the mysterious, complex world of completion bonds is little known outside the financing of movies and TV. Could you define the completion bond, how much it costs, what it protects, and also what happens in the unhappy event the bond must be invoked?
Sure. Well, it's true. I meet a lot of people who ask me what I do, and when I tell them about the completion bonds, they always come back with saying they never knew that such a thing even existed. So let me try to break it down as simply as I can. So this is going to be a little bit of bonding 101. First off, the completion bond is something the production company purchases for the benefit of the film's financiers, whether they're lenders or investors. While working with a bond company can be very useful to the film producers, the bond itself doesn't provide any protection for the film producer unless that producer is investing his or her own money into the production. So it's basically a tool that provides protection and security for financiers. And here's what it does in general. First thing, if for some reason the film is abandoned, meaning it's never completed or delivered to anyone, then the bond company is going to pay the film's financiers whatever sums they loaned or invested in the film, plus interest. The purpose is to put the financiers back in the same position they would otherwise have been in if they never had financed the film. Secondly, if the film is completed, but it costs more than the final approved budget to produce and deliver it, then the bond company will fund the cost of those budget cost overruns. That way, the film's financiers are protected in the event the film goes over budget. And thirdly, if the film is not properly or timely delivered to one of the distributors, for example, a producer misses the delivery date or fails to shoot the approved screenplay, and the distributor refuses to pay the minimum guarantee it contracted to pay for the right to distribute the film, then the bond company will pay that amount to the film's financiers. That way, the film's financiers are protected in the event the film is not delivered to distributors as promised. There's some caveats that go along with this. So some conditions. First, a financier can only make a claim under the bond if the amount of the budget has been made available to the producers to produce the film. So if any financier ever chooses to stop cash flowing the production, then the productions under the bond are lost. Secondly, the cost of what we term as enhancements, which are creative improvements the producer and financiers agree to add to the film. It could be things like adding more expensive music, or perhaps adding additional visual effects, or shooting a new ending, anything that wasn't envisioned at the start of the project. The cost of those enhancements are not going to be covered by the bond. Those have to be financed by the financiers or producers. Thirdly, the bond company has what are termed takeover rights, which means that if the bond company believes the project is not going to be completed on time and on budget, then it has the ability to take over and manage the production with either the existing crew, or it can choose to make additions or changes as it sees fit. And lastly, the film budget needs to include both the bond fee and a contingency allowance. So the contingency allowance, typically, again, it depends on the size of the budget, but generally runs around 8 to 10%, and it serves sort of like a deductible under an insurance policy. It means that the bond company is not going to be responsible for paying or funding those cost overruns until that contingency has been fully expended. And then the bond fee typically runs around 2 to 3% of the budget. Again, it will depend on the size of the budget, and it's typically subject to a minimum fee, which usually only comes into play on really small budgets. I think you also asked me what happens if the bond is invoked. You know, before we ever issue a bond, we're meeting with the production team, you know, and the producers to gain a complete understanding of how they plan to go about making their film. We break down the budget, the schedule, and if it's appropriate, we'll suggest adjustments to improve them. And by the time we sign off on a project, we have a firm belief that the film can be made for the resources, both in time and money, that are being made available to the producers. That said, totally unforeseen things do happen, and they happen on movie sets and on location. So if there comes a time when we believe the film is likely to go over budget or schedule, we will meet and confer with the production team and discuss how best to put things back on track. You know, if there's a consensus that the reason for all the difficulties is one particular person who's causing all the problems, then yeah, we'll do something about that person. That could be anything from replacing that person, or perhaps more likely hiring additional staff to support that person. But it's typically not the fault of any one person, and we just work with the producers to plan how best to reduce, if not eliminate, the over budget costs. And in the end, if there are over budget costs, or there's an abandonment or a delivery failure, then we adjust and pay the financier's claim as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Steve. That's a great overview. We really appreciate it. The process itself can be somewhat confusing, but you really made it clear. So thank you. What I wanted to do is I wanted to jump into current events or recent past. Maybe that's the better, and hopefully a better future. And what I'm referring to is all of us are beginning to come out of the pandemic crisis slowly but surely. Particularly here in the United States, in a few countries around the world that we've seen vaccination at a high rate, and hopefully over time around the world. We wanted to get your analysis as to how generally the bond industry fared and dealt with the various production challenges this past year.
Yeah, well, the pandemic took a big toll on our entire industry, and in particular, independent film production, as well as the bond industry. At the start of the pandemic, there were many bonded productions that had to be postponed, either because someone became infected, or more likely, it was due to government shutting down businesses and issuing stay-at-home orders for everyone except for essential workers. We and other bond companies were still responsible to complete and deliver those films on schedule and budget. The productions that we bonded that were in post were all completed remotely. Post was slowed some due to COVID, but we were able to get them all completed and delivered as promised. The productions that were in photography were more complicated. Just as one example, we had a production that had completed about a third of photography, shooting in New Zealand, that had to be shut down. It was shut down for several months. And then eventually, when the government had lifted their stay-at-home orders and people could return to work, we still had to petition the government to permit the actors to return to complete production because there were still travel bans in place. And those actors had to be quarantined, and the production had to adhere to new health and safety protocols, which cost a lot of money to adhere to. And fortunately for all involved, including UniFi, the production had civil authority coverage under the film production insurance policy. And that insurance was there to cover all the increased costs due to COVID. Projects that were in development or pre-production were postponed or shelved forever. It was a mess. Producers didn't know when cast would become available because they first had to complete the projects that were delayed due to the pandemic. Once the unions blessed new health and safety protocols, the producers were faced with finding ways to cover, some significant additional costs. Insurance and bond companies, including UniFi, were no longer able to cover communicable diseases under their policies, and that continues as we speak. And at least traditional production lenders were unable to take on the communicable disease risks and can no longer provide production loans except to perhaps the high worth producers that could and were willing to assume that risk themselves. So it took a big toll on the industry, and there were just far fewer production starts. We've been fortunate to source projects that have been shooting in countries where the virus was more controlled, or where the producers have been successful in securing insurance without the coronavirus exclusions before the pandemic ever started, or in countries such as Australia, the UK, and Canada, where the governments have now provided some limited coverage for COVID losses.
Thank you, Steve. I think we just have one more question. And as we look to the future, what is your prognosis? What do you think the completion bonds industry may be changing in the future, maybe adapting in the future?
In the near term, I still think we're likely to see more production starts, but still lower than pre-pandemic levels. I don't think our Congress is going to pass COVID coverage legislation anytime soon, if ever. It would be a big boost if that would happen, but I just don't see it right now. And it took the guild several months to come to an agreement on the new health and safety protocols, and they're likely to remain in place for several more months, even once the virus is under control. And even when production companies might be able to warrant that their cast and crew is fully or close to fully vaccinated. And, I would say all bets are off if any of the variants, take hold and cause another surge in infections and hospitalizations. But, looking ahead, 6 to 12 months from now, I'm much more optimistic. As the virus decreases significantly, I'm hopeful that the health and safety protocols may be relaxed. It won't be as expensive for producers, and financiers will start coming back into the market and provide production loans, notwithstanding that there's still not going to be any insurance or bond coverage for COVID. I think the independent production industry has always been very resilient, whether it's producers or lenders, investors, sales companies or distributors. We always seem to find new ways to meet new challenges, and I expect we'll find ways to meet our current challenges as well. So I'm very hopeful that sometime in the next year, we'll be able to revert to some sense of normalcy, even if many of us are still going to be working remotely.
Yeah, well said. Just want to quickly thank you, Jason, for joining myself, and more importantly, on behalf of Jason and myself, we want to thank you, Steve, for joining us in this conversation about, even though it may be brief, there's a lot more we can learn, but we do appreciate the time that you've taken to join us.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me, guys.
And I wanted to thank everybody for joining us and listening into this podcast. Thank you all.